We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for?
Those masters of the universe are at it again.
They're not sending their best.
You maniac! You blow it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And today we're talking with Jason Owens, who retired earlier this year as Chief of the Border Patrol. He was the 26th head of the Border Patrol, had almost close to 30 years of experience in the Border Patrol, and is a font of information and experience that I thought it would be valuable for people to hear from. So thanks for coming on the show, Jason. And
thanks for having me, Mark. Appreciate it.
Sure. And if you could start, just how did you get into being in the Border Patrol? Everybody's got different ways into it. Some people were in the Army, some people, whatever, they lived on the border or something. But how did you, what's your story?
Well, they definitely, with me, they got the unmodeled lump of clay. I was 21 years old and had really never left my hometown. As we were talking about before, I grew up in Oklahoma, a little town called Tahlequah, as the capital of the Cherokee Nation, and that was my whole world. And I knew when I graduated from high school that I wanted to get into law enforcement or military or something. I had that calling to want to serve, and it's, you can imagine, especially in a small town, it's tough to get into a law enforcement profession or anything like that unless you know somebody or you have experience. And so if you want to get into that field, you have to be willing to go where the work is.
Sure.
And I applied because I saw information about the Border Patrol at a career fair. And I tell everybody this: I saw motorcycles, I saw horses, I saw snowmobiles, and it looked like fun. Man, the rest is history, because you go through the hiring process. And again, because I hadn't really done much, my background investigation took about 10 seconds. And,
right.
And here I am.
Yeah, very good. So you started in mid-90s, right? 96?
Yes.
That was around the time when Border Patrol started to change its approach to patrolling, as I understand it. I mean, I was around doing what I'm doing now, but obviously from the outside, there was something called Operation Hold the Line in El Paso, and then something similar in San Diego. And the point was stop people from getting across at all rather than chase them around once they got in. What was that like? Was the Border Patrol changing then? Was it growing? What were your initial impressions?
It really was. That was a very interesting time for the Border Patrol, because as I understand it, and talking to some of my mentors and people I looked up to, that was really the first time that the Border Patrol tried to do a meaningful national strategy. So you mentioned Operation Hold the Line. You had Operation Gatekeeper. You had Operation Rio Grande. And basically, that was centered around the premise of forward deploying to deter people from crossing in the first place. Always in the past, you had agents that would be on patrol, and they would catch or interdict anything that came across the border illegally. And it was largely an immigration enforcement effort. Well, this forward deployed the agents to deter people from coming across illegally in particularly densely populated areas. So the idea was to push the traffic out to more remote areas where we would have more time to detect and apprehend them. And that was done, as you said, in a few different locations. And one of them was San Diego. And it was a very busy time for the Border Patrol then. A lot of folks don't remember, but the Border Patrol throughout its history has had its ups and downs of the amount of flow it sees with respect to illegal border crossings. The 90s were no different. San Diego, as you might remember, was exceptionally busy back in that time. So they put forth this Operation Gatekeeper, and it started to push the traffic out to where I was assigned, which was the El Centro sector in Calexico, California. And so very quickly, we found ourselves overwhelmed. The size of the Border Patrol, and this is a good analogy for how the Border Patrol looked. When I got to the Calexico station, my class effectively doubled the size of every muster. They were putting out 5, maybe 10 people
Wow.
shift if they were lucky. And along comes my class, a bunch of new guys, and you can imagine, that size of a class, everything we did, good, bad, or otherwise, was under a microscope. But so much was getting away, and so much that we were catching was just a turnstile approach, because largely it was economic migration, folks coming up from Mexico.
And from Mexico, yeah. In other words, it wasn't even Central Americans that much; it was just Mexicans, right?
Exactly, and so you may see the same person 3 or 4 times, and they would always take a voluntary return back to Mexico, and then ultimately they may make it through, and the belief is they would do their seasonal works and remittances home, which was a big part of the Mexican economy and the families back in that time. They'd go home for the holidays, and then the cycle would repeat itself. And that was kind of the life we lived in the 90s and going into the early 2000s before 9/11. It wasn't unusual for that station, Calexico, to catch anywhere from 400 to 600 people per shift.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that we processed and handled that traffic was much different than what we see today. And you mentioned how the Border Patrol has changed. It went from being 3,000 or 4,000 agents to all of a sudden massive growth in the early 2000s to ultimately what it is today, over 20,000 agents.
Right. So you were chief you became chief, 2023. So you were about, roughly 2 years as chief?
2 years.
And it was the worst part of the border crisis. And, I have my own thoughts about why that happened and what was involved. But what was your experience of dealing with the border crisis during the Biden administration?
Well, I just looked at it as a challenge like any other that we get faced with. The Border Patrol, that's what we do. We deal with difficult situations. A lot of times they are no-win situations, and we do the best we can. In that particular moment, whether it's the policies or the messaging of the day, it contributed to the increased volume of illicit border crossings that was taking place. And when you get in a role like the chief or any senior leadership role, the good thing about having it be a career service person is because they're always going to be looking back and looking at the agency and looking at the mission and trying to represent that to the political appointees. You have to have political appointees. Everybody knows that, because they represent the people that the American people elect. And that's who we answer to at the end of the day.
Right.
But where that line meets, where you have the political appointees, they are more concentrated on the mission and the focus of the administration and executing on that. And they work with the career service, senior executive service members that actually, they represent the mission and the agency itself. You don't ever want that to get pushed down too low. The fear is, if you have that political appointee at a lower position, then you start to dilute and lose sight of what the mission is and what's best for that agency. Because at the end of the day, administrations come and go, politicians come and go, and what's left is the actually agency and the mission. And in some cases, we're left to pick up the pieces, and in some cases, we're left worse off, and others were left better off.
Right.
So my outlook on that position was to try and influence and do the best I could for the mission and for the agency. Sometimes that's damage control. Sometimes that is to try and throw up a challenge flag where you can and say, this is a bad idea, or here's another good idea. And you just try and navigate your family, for want of a better word, your agency that you've spent decades in, through a very trying time, and you do the best you can. When that's over, you step off the train and you watch it go down the tracks and hopefully hold your head up high.
So what kind of effect did that have on morale in the Border Patrol? Because, I remember talking to agents in Yuma, for instance, in the height of this. We used to go to, 12 7/8 is the area where they would go around the end of the fence where the one of the reservations was. And, they were not super enthusiastic. Let me put it that way, about what they were doing, because, they didn't sign up to go buy baby formula at Walmart. They signed up to, ride horses and ride snowmobiles and what have you, like you said, and go and track down people. So what did it do to morale from your perspective?
Of course, morale was really low, and it's to be expected. I think an important part that needs to be remembered and not taken for granted is why the morale was low during that time.
Yeah.
it's important not to make the distinction or to say that the morale was low because Border Patrol agents, for some reason, dislike immigration or have anything against people that want to come to this country, because nothing could be further from the truth. You will not find a group of people that risk their lives more for migrants or do more to try and help migrants than Border Patrol agents. People don't realize that.
Sure.
What drives morale down is we know what's going on out there. We know that there are honest threats. There are things that are capable of doing this country harm. There are people that we do not want to come into our communities because they're criminals, because they're bad actors. And so we know that while we're pulled off of the mission to deal with illegal immigration, there's this piece over here that's taking advantage of it. And that's what we signed up to do, to protect the American people from those type of threats. We're always going to be there and try and help save a life or help somebody in need, because that's just the type of person that signed up to do a job like this. The morale was never low because of all the immigration that was taking place. It was low because the mission was suffering because we were having to deal with this, and we should not have had to deal with this.
Right, right. So what is like I said, you were in there for almost 30 years, so you have some history in the lack of border barriers, walls and fences, and then the dramatic expansion of them while you were in the patrol. What's your thinking about the efficacy and limits and what have you of physical barriers on the border?
It's a force multiplier. And why on earth that became a 4-letter word over the years it's beyond me. It's a tool that gives the advantage to the law enforcement agencies out in the field in trying to stop crime from taking place. No different than cameras. It's no different than a bulletproof vest. It's no different than a radio. Deployed in the right areas, it has a good impact on our ability to secure the border. And that's another thing I think is very important that we can't lose sight of. Just because illegal immigration is down, that does not translate to a secure border.
Right.
If there are still areas where our adversaries, the cartels, the smugglers, the criminals, can still exploit to come and go as they please, and we don't have the ability to detect, respond to, and interdict them, then the border is not secure. So illegal immigration being down is a great thing. And that's something that we should all be happy about. But let's not take our foot off the gas. Let's keep pushing forward for those critical infrastructure pieces, those things like border barrier, those things like surveillance technology, those things like infrastructure that allow our agents to respond to traffic whenever they do detect it. The wall itself, let's talk about that for a second, because I got so tired of having to answer the same question.
Sorry to ask you again, but
no, but it's important.
Yeah.
So let's take it down. Let's take downtown Laredo. I was assigned to Laredo sector for several years. If you put a wall in a place like that, and how many times have you heard, well, you build me a 30-foot wall and I'll use a 31-foot ladder.
Right.
Well, okay. But it's going to take you a lot longer to traverse that 30-foot wall than if you were just running across an open space.
Right.
So that lengthens the time that law enforcement has to be able to detect your attempt to cross, to respond to you, and it increases the certainty that we're going to arrest you. That is what that wall does in the right spot. Now, put it out in the middle of the desert, maybe we don't need a wall. Maybe what we need there is roads and cameras, because we have a lot more time to see you and respond to you.
Right.
So used in the right spot, it's a game changer. It's a huge force multiplier. And that's not a bad thing. People try and just take it to one extreme to the other and say, well, people can still climb the wall, so it must not be useful. Well, nobody ever said that it was intended to stop. If it was that easy, we'd have a wall, everywhere.
Right. I mean, the analogy I draw is like locking your car. Somebody can break into your car, but you lock it anyway because there's fewer people who can do it, and it would take longer
Absolutely.
to steal your car. It's all about, slowing down bad guys and deterring them, not some kind of magical silver bullet that will stop everything.
100%. So that's, and if you ask most Border Patrol agents, that will be their take on the wall.
So what are some of the future challenges? I mean, you retired from the Border Patrol now, but obviously you've got a lot of experience in this, and looking forward with better control of the physical border now that we have illegal immigration is down. What are some of the future challenges? For instance, is maritime illegal immigration, where people take boats up the coast and come in, is that going to be a new thing? And also, along the same lines, how about Canada? Because there's really no sense to building a wall on Canadian border. I mean, it would seem kind of silly, but there's still, potential challenges there. So in other words, what does the Border Patrol have to look for and keep its eye on in the future?
You'll hear us talk about TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, particularly of our adversaries. So I'll talk about that in a second. But before I get to that, I do want to mention this. It's very important. A big challenge for us right now is the general public's malaise of the topic. We don't want people to ignore or stop thinking about the border because it's been so front and center for all these years. Just because illegal immigration is down,
right?
Don't take your eye off the prize. Take advantage of this respite and expand our presence and get better prepared so that we can help ensure that the border is secure. And kind of dovetailing into what you're talking about, it does not just mean the southwest border with Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people forget about that. You have almost 2,000 miles of Mexico border, and you have about 4,000 miles of border with Canada if you don't count that vertical slash of 1,500 miles that Alaska shares with Canada. And then you literally have thousands of miles of coast.
Mm-hmm.
So I say all that whenever you talk about an agency the size of Border Patrol, 20,000 plus, or even CBP, 65,000 plus, that sounds like a lot until you start to disperse them over that vast of an area, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. That number starts to dwindle. So you have to have those force multipliers. And to your point, so if you're an adversary of means, and you probably know some of the things that we know, are you going to try and cross someplace where it's more conducive for us to catch you? Or are you going to try and go someplace where you think that you have the advantage? Canada is a very appealing area for that. The coast is a very appealing area for that. So they may not have the flow or the volume in those areas that you might see on the U.S.-Mexico border, but the threat may be significantly higher. The folks that are trying to cross there may represent a much more significant threat than what you see crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. That's why having those force multipliers that we've been talking about are so very important. If it's not a wall up there, it's the cameras, it's the sensors, the ability to detect the cross-border traffic. And up there, you want to talk about remote. I worked in Grand Forks, North Dakota, and Minnesota. I worked up in the entire state of Maine. They literally coined the phrase, you can't get there from here.
Right.
There is no direct route. Sometimes a sensor will go off and it will take a very long time for our agents to be able to respond to it. Make that better. Make it easier for them to get to the area and respond. Make it to where they have a better chance of detecting the traffic. That can make all the difference in the world to actually get eyes on. And what this will do as well, and I think this is something that the Border Patrol continues to focus on. It was something that we were focusing on when I was there, is try to make that objective case. If you have persistent surveillance across the border, what that does, it enables you to make an objective case. This is the threat. This is the adversary. This is what's coming at us. And you kind of put that decision in the hands of the appropriators and say, you decide if you want to fund that, if that's a priority for you or not.
Right.
Right now, there's too much ambiguity. We don't have the persistent surveillance. And so that's where the politics lives. There's folks that will say that we're doomsday, sayers, that we're trying to scare people by saying what we think is happening.
Right.
And there's others that are saying that we're trying to hide what's actually happening. Let's make that objective case so that everybody sees what we see and say, this is what's coming across every day. This is what we need to stop. It makes it a lot easier to get behind if it's not an abstract thought, if it's something tangible that they can see.
So kind of along those lines, you can't predict everything. I mean, there may well be surges, even if they're not politically driven. Now, often they're going to be responding to political, currents in the United States. This often happens, but there are going to be instances where there are going to be surges that are out of our control. How does the Border Patrol plan for that kind of thing?
Well, that's what I was talking about before, right? Don't take your foot off the gas. Continue to prepare. So if you have the landscape, if you have the battle space set so that it's advantageous for you and you can actually control that flow better, then you're going to be in a better situation. The other thing is you take the lessons learned. So anytime that we've seen an influx or a surge, one of the things that you'll notice is the smugglers, the cartels, they are trying to find a loophole in any of the systems that they can find. We talked about it before. Back in the 90s, you had predominantly single adult males that were coming from Mexico, and they would come across and they would work. Well, whenever it became too easy to stop them and send them back, then you started seeing family units come across.
Right.
Then you started seeing unaccompanied children coming across. Then you started seeing people from countries that other than Mexico, that were a little bit more difficult. You couldn't just voluntarily return them. You can't send somebody back to Mexico if they're from Honduras, because Mexico is under no obligation to take them back.
Right.
You can't send somebody back to Venezuela that's from Venezuela because we don't have any diplomatic relations with them. And believe it or not, most people don't realize this, the home country is under no obligation to take their own citizens back.
Right.
So there's a whole political process that's at play with the State Department and everybody that helps feed into our ability to do that job. But the adversary is always looking for the loophole to try and exploit. So to be ready for that. And this is the time where we start having the immigration reform, where we start actually passing laws that make it where it's more difficult to find and exploit those loopholes. This last time, it was asylum.
Right.
People came in and they wanted to claim asylum, or they fear of returning back to their country for whatever reason. And it overwhelmed the system. They effectively created the loophole that they were using by crossing in the numbers that they crossed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have to find a way to take that away, learn that lesson, close that loophole, and make it more difficult for them to find the next one. That's going to be the challenge.
Right, right. There was a lot of talk about how the flow diversified so much. It wasn't just Mexican men coming to work on farms or construction. Now, much of that diversification was still Latin America, Central America first, and then the rest of Latin America. But there was a pretty significant share of people from all kinds of, non-Spanish speaking countries. You had, I've met Georgians, people from the Republic of Georgia on the border, and there were, Chinese, and there were Russians. I've met on the Mexican side in a shelter there, people from, I think, Kyrgyzstan and somebody from Kazakhstan. So my point here is kind of a practical one. How do agents deal with people? Agents have to be able to speak Spanish. That's a requirement of either before you get there or at least when you graduate. You need to be able to converse basically. It's an obvious requirement of it's necessary. But, you can't have agents who know Georgian and Kazakh and Tajik and Mandarin and everything else. How did you guys deal with that?
Well, so we have the translation services that we would try and use through some third parties. Mm-hmm. But even then, even they have a difficulty finding fluent speakers in some of these dialects that, again, this is something that most people don't realize, but every year, 150 plus countries that we're catching people crossing the border illegally. You're right. The vast majority do come from Mexico, Central and South America. It's just because of the proximity to the U.S. border. But you're absolutely right. We see people from all over the world and from all walks of life. And it's tough sometimes because you can't always find somebody that can converse. And especially if you're trying to build a case against the smuggling network that's responsible for bringing these folks over, it can be especially difficult. And you don't know if that translator on the other end of the phone is translating exactly what that person is saying or what you're saying. So the ability to get that the software nowadays that can actually start to do the translation, I think that's going to be a huge leap forward. Leveraging AI and machine learning. Those are, you ask about some of the things that are going to be important into the future for a whole host of reasons. That technology is going to be a game changer for how we secure the border, both from a cyber perspective and from a physical perspective.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of that. So one of the things I wanted to ask about is the big, beautiful bill. Now, you're not in anymore, but the bill has a huge amount of money for all kinds of things, for ICE, et cetera, but also for hiring new Border Patrol agents. And you actually were in charge of the Border Patrol Academy at one point. Was it the one that was in El Paso, or was that in charge in Glencoe? Where were you in charge?
Artesia, New Mexico. Okay. So it's just north of El Paso a little bit. So that's probably the only thing. But yeah, so that's our basic training center.
But one of the challenges any law enforcement agency is going to face when the politicians say we need to hire more cops is there pressure to cut corners, that kind of thing. Was there, I've been told by some agents that some of the requirements they had in the past, in past hiring surges, were actually kind of watered down or changed. For instance, it used to be, and correct me here if I'm wrong, but I'd been given to understand that if you grew up on the border, you were never posted in the town you were from, just because if grandma lives across the river, you could be as honest as the day is long, but they put a gun to her head. What are you going to, what are they going to do? So, and that was thrown out the window. So my point, generally speaking, is what are the challenges in ramping up hiring? And is the issue of cutting corners one that's a real potential danger?
It absolutely is. And it's one that we have to keep a keen eye on and not let slip, because it's easy when you are under pressure to try and, because everybody wants to grow the force. You want to recruit more people, but you have to do it with care. You have to do it so that you preserve the standards, and you have to look at it from the perspective of the agent, the man or woman that's standing out there on the border. You want to make sure that the person that's working to their right and left deserves to be there, and if they can trust them. That's something that you're having to do to keep the faith with them. That's why you're in these positions. The other thing is you want to make sure that the good of the agency is thought about.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is if you hire 10,000 people today, you may be able to get to that TO that you're trying to get to. But what's going to happen in 20, 25 years from now?
What?
The bottom's going to fall out because they all retire.
Oh, I see.
And you're going to be right back into trying to do a massive hiring push again. So you have to do it at a gradual incline so that you, number one, don't see that sharp drop, and you're able to, your recruiting and hiring pipeline can sustain that number.
That. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And you also have to make sure you don't lose all that institutional knowledge in one fell swoop.
Right.
Because how do you replace? You can replace an agent with another agent, but you cannot replace a 20-year, tenured journeyman agent that's used to working an area with another person that just graduated the academy.
Right.
I don't care how in good a shape that person is or what their grades were in their classes. They're not going to be on the same level as that journeyman agent. So you have to think about things like that, because that's good for the mission and it's good for the agency. A lot of times and it doesn't matter what side of the aisle we're talking about, when you make a promise to grow the workforce, you always think about doing it. Okay, it's got to be done soon.
Right.
That may not be the best course of action. You have to have a ramp up. The other thing that happens is the applicant pool has to be a quality one. And you have to remember that all law enforcement agencies are basically fishing from that same pond, same pool. So if somebody that wants to be in law enforcement like me, you're going to apply for state and local, you're going to apply for federal, you're going to apply for multiple agencies.
Interesting. Yeah.
Well, so you have to be appealing to that applicant more so than the next agency. Mm-hmm. So that's where you start getting into, okay, are we going to let them work where they want to work? Because if they don't get to go to McAllen and they're from McAllen, they're just going to go to work for ICE or for the Marshal Service. So that's another competing factor.
Right. I hadn't thought of that.
Do you give them incentives? Pay them a bonus. Well, you pay them a bonus to sign on. Well, you have a tenured agent that's been here 7 years that says, hey, I didn't get a sign-on bonus. Right. Where's mine?
Yeah.
So you have the applicant pool that's important. Then you have the hiring pipeline, the onboarding process.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have enough HR specialists, if you don't have enough people to run background checks, it's a funnel. So you can have plenty of applicants that are ready to go, but you can only get so many through the pipeline unless you hire that support network in the background.
Right. Yeah.
Then you get them to the academy. And when you have them at the academy, they can only graduate as many as the bandwidth of FLETC will allow.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, FLETC doesn't just train Border Patrol. They train every federal agency. And they only have so many firing ranges, so many classrooms, so many other venues, driving venues that everybody's competing for. And so you may only be able to put through classes to graduate 1,500 people a year.
Right.
And if your attrition is matching or exceeding that, you're not even going to be able to maintain your current number, let alone grow. So there's that whole process that you have to grow and expand and increase the capability of to be able to do what you're talking about. And then the last part. So the Border Patrol works in some pretty remote places. You can make a plan to send, make up something, 500 agents to Tahoe, Arizona, or Presidio, Texas. Where are they going to live?
Right.
What schools are they going to go to?
There's nothing much in Aho. I've been to Aho. Yeah.
So you have to allow for the community to be able to support that number of people, and that takes years to accomplish. So I don't know that those things get taken into account when we start talking about growing a workforce and what that means for the entirety of the system and the community that they're out there supporting.
Yeah, no, that's that last part I hadn't thought about at all. But another constraint that occurred to me is that something you alluded to when you were a new agent and you'd sort of doubled the number of people in El Centro. Like you said, you can be, as you get the highest grades and you can be the best marksman and your Spanish can be outstanding. But until you've worked with shadowed an experienced agent, there's got to be all kinds of things that you just didn't expect and don't know about. You need that experience. And so even that requires, in other words, even that's a kind of funnel, is it not? Because you can't send two rookies out there who don't know anything about what they're doing,
No, and it's dangerous for them,
right?
And it's dangerous for the people they're going to encounter. So yeah, you talk to any agent, if they're being honest, they'll tell you we all make our share of mistakes because it's a tough job to learn, and you are literally out there by yourself. That's one of the things that's great about it is you have a lot of autonomy,
right?
But it's also one of the things that can get you in a bad way really quick. So you need that experience that's there that's telling you, okay, this is the way you need to do it. This is the way you need to be thinking. And it helps build your confidence until you're able to one day be able to do it effectively yourself.
So the last thing I wanted to ask about is you were chief during the Border Patrol's centenary. Border Patrol turned 100 years old last year. It was 1924 to 2024. What was that like? What did you all do? How did the Border Patrol deal with its 100th anniversary?
Well, it's we had big plans. And unfortunately, we had never tried to do anything like that before. And I think we probably bit off more than we could chew. So we didn't get to celebrate it as well as we would have liked. But it's a big deal if you think about how that agency has evolved over time. I mean, it started off in 1924. And in fact, even before 1924, you had, mounted watchmen that they were out there with their own horse, and riding, doing much the same job. So what it is today, and you see, I'm in awe when I see the capability of these agents that are out there today. The example I always use, we have our mobile scope trucks, the ones that have the IR capability that you can. And when I was out on patrol, it was a joystick, much like the Atari, joystick that we played, as kids.
Right.
And just about 10 or 12 years ago, they were using those Xbox controllers that had 10 or 12 buttons on them, and they're making them do all kinds of things. And that's a very simple example, but I'm looking at them like I wouldn't know how to how to make that thing work, and they're doing it just like it's second nature. Well, now they're using AI. They're coming up with programs to help do their job better on their own. It's an amazing thing to see when you see how far this agency has come and the scope and breadth of its mission. It's no longer just an immigration mission. It is a national security entity that plays a big piece in keeping this country and our way of life safe. I mean, so of course we want to celebrate that. We want to celebrate that every year and every day. The 100-year mark was especially important for all of us. And I was very honored to be able to be the chief during that time. I wish we would have been able to celebrate it the way that we all intended. But that said, I think we're all proud to be a part of that agency and what it's become.
Well, thanks, Chief Owens. Well, actually, kind of my last question is, what are you up to now? You're, you don't seem to be doddering. You seem to be pretty vigorous still. So what's the next chapter for Jason Owens?
Well, for me, it's just like all of us. You spend a lot of time sacrificing the things that you probably shouldn't be sacrificing. Your time with family and your being able to enjoy life a little bit. And what's the adage? You work to live, you don't live to work.
Right. Yeah.
Well, most of us don't do that whenever we're in a job like the Border Patrol.
Sure.
And so, I have two boys that are both on active duty. One's in the Navy, one's in the Air Force. I have a granddaughter. I get a chance to reconnect with them and spend time. I've already been doing that. I get a chance to travel with my wife and my folks as they get older. That is very much a priority, and I think it is for all of us when we're retired. I'm not going to stop working. I think I'm still too young for that, but I am very definitely focused in that direction right now. And it's something that I told to the trainees when I was the chief of the EKA. And I don't want to be a hypocrite. I want to practice what I preach.
Sounds good. Sounds good. You earned it. So thanks for sitting down with us. Jason Owens was the 26th Chief of the Border Patrol, retired earlier this year. Appreciate your sharing your insights with us, and hope your trips with your wife are enjoyable. And thanks for sitting down with us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And finally, a little update on something we talked about 2 weeks ago. This was the report that Steve Camerata and Karen Ziegler did on the decline in the illegal population from January to July. Just to update you, what they found was that the current population survey, which is run by the Census Bureau, finds a decline in 2.2 million in the immigrant population during the first 6 months of the year, including a 1.6 million decline in the illegal population. This was picked up and distributed quite widely, was covered widely. The Homeland Security Secretary talked about it. DHS promoted it in a lot of its various media. The Department of Justice referred to it in a filing they submitted to the Supreme Court. So this was a pretty widely reported and impactful, I hate that word, but I can't think of another one now, impactful report that we did. But there's been a lot of criticism that maybe what this is artificial in the statistics, because immigrants, especially illegal immigrants, just aren't responding to the government surveys because they're afraid of enforcement policies under Trump. And we acknowledge that as a possibility in the report. We were upfront about this. So what Steve Camerata, our research director, posted this week was a short look at some of the reasons that it might actually not be fake. In other words, that the decline may well be real. He and his team are doing a more in-depth look at the quality of the foreign-born numbers in the survey. But what in this blog post from this week, what Steve pointed out is that the response rate, in other words, the percentage of people responding to the survey that the Census Bureau does, that we base this on, has been declining over the past several years. But it's been declining kind of at a steady rate, and there was no bigger decline following Trump's inauguration and the institution of these new pro-enforcement policies. In other words, there doesn't seem to have been much change. And that kind of steady rate of decline, which could have all kinds of other reasons. It's not just immigrants declining to respond to the survey, just everybody. This is a broad problem in all kinds of surveying. That consistent kind of steady, slow decline happened when immigration numbers were reported to be increasing dramatically under Biden, and the same rate, basically, when the survey shows the numbers have been decreasing during this year since Trump was inaugurated. So none of this is a guarantee or a slam dunk, but it does clearly suggest, at least so far, there is no evidence that the decline in the immigrant population that we recorded is somehow, just a fake result based on survey problems. The survey does seem to have captured a real thing. We may find out with, in more in-depth analysis that that's not the case, but the objections to this finding so far don't seem to be well-founded. And we will follow up in the future, but it does seem that the immigrant population has significantly declined, and most of that is illegal. Most of that is a decline in the illegal immigrant population since January of this year. And, clearly, from our perspective, that's a good sign. Policy works, but whether you like it or not, the question is it happening? And it does seem to actually be happening. That's it for this week's episode of Parsing Immigration Policy. This is Mark Krikorian, your host. Thank you to Brian Griffith, our producer, for making this work. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. If you have any suggestions, compliments, criticisms, suggestions for future episodes, just email us at center@cis.org. And I hope you'll be tuning in next week.